This is Anthony Hernandez, and I'm a doctoral student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm a graduate student researcher at the Center for Research on College Workforce Transition. And today I have the great pleasure of interviewing Deborah Santiago, who is the CEO and co-founder at Excelencia in Education. Deborah, welcome.
Thank you so much. So happy to be with you, Anthony.
So I've so been looking forward to this conversation because I've viewed the good work of Excelencia in Education for many years. And I think of it as a disruptive, that is disrupting the status quo organization, a team of researchers that are making an impact. And I think we should start out with, I'd love to hear from you to describe your organization in your own words.
Sure. So we've had the good fortune at Excelencia. We're 16 years old, and our mission is to accelerate Latino student success in higher education. And for us, that's not to the exclusion of others, but it's also not apologizing for starting looking at this young, fast-growing population and how we can look at issues that seem intractable in different ways. And that, with a policy lens, is a way of looking at these issues at scale. So Anthony, I appreciate even the comment of being disruptive. I think in some venues, in a policy space, we can be seen as very disruptive, and others, I think, maybe we're not pushing hard or fast enough. And I think part of our commitment is to talk to decision makers about our population and at scale, and see what can we do to create the space and opportunity that our community deserves, and see us from an asset-based perspective. So that's a lot of what we try to do. I think the disruptive part is that rather than think about us as a deficit or a crisis, we really are trying to be asset-based in what's working and working with those that are committed to that common cause.
I think one of the things that we have to note about your organization is that it is high impact, and also it is led by two people of color, and that is groundbreaking in itself. And you've both been doing important work in the policy orbit for 15 years with this organization. But I know that your own history goes back to working at the Department of Education, where there was an important milestone step where Hispanic-Serving Institutions were initially recognized and then started to be funding. But I think that the work that you're doing is groundbreaking, for instance, with things like the Seal of Excelencia. And so I feel like that is an important contribution that your organization has made to the field, and that is disrupting the status quo. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that credential. Sure.
So that is true, Anthony. In some ways, I'm kind of dating myself. I was in the Department of Education as a civil servant in '94, and Hispanic-Serving Institutions were first funded in 1995. And the department didn't know what to do, how to outreach and engage people to apply for this money. So I've been tracking it for 25 years now. And we kept hearing this focus, the definition is one that's enrollment-based. And after 20 years of listening and learning, institutions realized that's a necessary but not sufficient definition of what it means to serve our community. That's enrolling our community. And so we, as a small organization, said we really need to deconstruct what it means to serve our community and to be intentional in serving our community. And we can't just use graduation rates. That's not the best metric for institutional transformation. We've got to get to institutional transformation. And so we decided that we would take all the listening and learning and create a framework and a structure based on what we'd heard to certify institutions that were intentionally serving. So this is not about changing legislation, although I think it will inform and can raise the standard and expectation of serving our community in a more intentional and explicit manner. And I say we jumped off the cliff. We took a chance. We are not membership-based. We are not direct service providers. We try to work with those of common cause, listen, learn, and translate that to policy, Anthony. And so for us to create a credential that would really show the value of serving our students. And by that, I'll say the other part that maybe this is disruptive is it's not rocket science, but it's about data, practice, and leadership. And it means, are you enrolling? Are you retaining? Are you supporting financially? Are you transferring? Are you representing with faculty and staff? And are you graduating our students? That is something institutions have control over. I'm proud to say that we're in our second cohort of the certification. We've had more than 50 institutions apply, and we have 14 institutions that have been certified. And we see increasing interest. It is our expectation that institutions that are really committed to cause are going to be able to show that, not just tell us and with data, but that they can show they're practicing. That, I think, is core to the field. And institutions don't get any money for this either. This is a voluntary way of, I think, showing your commitment, your values as an institution and serving our common cause.
That's great. I think one of the other things it does that's really important is that you are kind of turning dominant culture rankings on their head, because those rankings usually don't fit well for Hispanic-serving institutions. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the tensions between and the difference between credentialing, like the Seal of Excelencia, and then the regular rankings.
Sure. So the rankings, people love if they're doing well, or institutions love if they're doing well in it. Those measures tend to be very, very traditional. So looking at traditional students on traditional pathways at traditional institutions. And that's great. And you can look at things like graduation rates, yield rates, all those things. And you compare and contrast institutions based on very traditional measures. And of course, the Ivy League, the privates, the institutions with large endowments look great in those metrics. And what we found is that those metrics are not appropriate for the hard work that institutions are doing, that are open access, that are serving students of color, that are looking to meet students where they're at and try to provide value-added education. And so the idea of ranking institutions presumes they're winners and losers. And from our perspective, too often our community has been put in the loser bracket because we don't meet that traditional profile and perspective and approach. And so the idea here is, rather than ranking institutions 1 to 20 with the top best of whatever it is, let's take a look at the intentionality of institutions and efforts. And conceivably, every institution can be credentialed. This is not a competition. We look at each institution compared to itself. We ask for 5 years of data. We're looking for momentum, not necessarily upward trajectory alone, although that's great potentially, but are we seeing an intentional effort in the growth or evolution of the data? Then we look at practices aligned to that. What are you doing? So if you take enrollment, your numbers could be going up because of demography and geography, not because of intentionality and impact. But your practice tells us a lot. Are you investing in outreach to the Latino community? Are you bringing in families? Do you have explicit efforts to engage? That tells us more about intentionality. That can help explain the data and not just one or the other. So for us, it's about, we can look at 2-year and 4-year with this framework and this model, because you're comparing an institution to its own skills and abilities, not competing with another institution in a way that's not appropriate because you serve different students in different communities.
And when I've talked with HSI leaders, system level leaders, they've had a call for this type of understanding. They have felt misunderstood by the dominant rankings. And I think it's such a key finding, this intentionality about the work. It's no longer just about the demographic requirement, but it's about the intentionality of serving those students. There are lots of important contributions that your organization has made. One of them that I want to highlight is the Growing What Works database. And so leaders that I talked to said, these are important ideas that we have to address in terms of Latino student success, but how do we do it? And I feel like your organization has made important strides towards providing that knowledge. I wonder if you could talk about that, please.
Sure. When we started Excelencia, there were just 2 of us, Sarita, my co-founder and colleague, and myself. And we wanted to focus on action. What are people doing? And we knew that so much of this deficit approach was this crisis and what wasn't happening, but that didn't resonate with us. We knew so many people that on the ground, day to day, were making a difference for students. And you couldn't find that anywhere unless by chance you were talking to somebody in a disparate way. So one of the things that we decided to do even when we started Excelencia, is if it doesn't exist, create it. Take that chance. And that fits our mission vision, because we wanted to serve our community and help, and couldn't find the resources, tools, the data, the analysis, the consistent and credible way of considering it, because it's more than demography. And so what we did, Anthony, is we solicited input. Back before we started Excelencia, Sarita and I were in federal government at the Department of Education at this White House initiative on educational access for Hispanic Americans. And then people were asking us, well, what works? What can we do for our community? And we said, lots of programs and efforts already exist. Let's bring them together. So we, every year, and it's been 16 years now, ask for nominations from across the country about what's working and evidence of effectiveness. And the Growing It Works database is our compilation of the top 20 finalists that are given every year. This year we had over 200 nominations. We had from 26 states, DC and Puerto Rico, that submitted. And we go through a rigorous process of not just hearing testimonials, but looking for data that shows this works. And we try to be succinct because we know that funders and elected officials need to be able to understand it clearly, what the success is and what needs to happen. And so we put together this database, frankly, cobbled it together with a couple $1,000s and did it ourselves, because we wanted to be a resource for others. We wanted there to be no excuses for inaction, right? We wanted every opportunity to say, if you want to address Latino males, you want to address guided pathways or serving migrant students, there are others that have done it. So Anthony, we also don't presume that we're the experts. So in there, we put in the contact information and evidence of effectiveness of these programs in hopes that this is a network of common cause, and we'll reach out to each other and listen and learn and hopefully grow awareness and attention and leverage that attention so that funders will fund those programs and efforts to serve our community. That's the intent of the database, is to show good work is happening. We want to bring positive attention to positive things. And we're grateful that we've been able to do that over these last 15 years. And we'll be starting again in February of 2021 with this common cause focus and effort. We are also tracking these programs. And unfortunately, despite really critical effort, there are programs that don't survive, don't sustain. And there are others that have been institutionalized, and that's a success story. But we try to keep the database up to date so that it's contemporary if you want to find what's working and you can actually reach someone. And that's actually a labor of love, because we don't have any funding to do it. We just believe it's really important to do.
It's a game changer. And I know as a researcher that you can't go through HSI literature without seeing Excelencia cited by all of the top scholars. The data and research that people draw on is pretty significant. But this is another layer, a tremendous contribution, the how-to. So I would encourage listeners to visit the website, to go through the database. It is really very broad, and it has so many different areas. I was going through it, and I thought, what an incredible feat. I want to shift gears here and talk a little bit about this kind of bizarre moment that we're in now with COVID-19. I want to know what you're hearing from the institutions that you work with in higher education. How have they been impacted, and how are they adjusting?
Yeah. If you don't mind, I'll take that two ways, Anthony. One is what we are hearing and seeing at the national level. So I'm grateful we are privileged to be able to work from home and acknowledge so many we work with that don't have that luxury. We work directly with institutions. I believe good policies informed by good practice, which is why the Growing It Works database, but also why we are working continually with institutions to listen and learn. And it's been, in some ways, very challenging. And a lot of people are talking about the challenges and barriers and others, and we can certainly get into that as well. But I also am continually inspired by those that are making it work. We work with a subset of institutions, a subset of HSIs and others. And I would tell you a key is that they know who they serve. So, and they've been adjusting and adapting to serve them well, Anthony. And so that means that, and often with little resources. So the pivot, the ability to adjust and adapt, that persistence, I think that defines so many of us who are doing so much with so little. And our community has significant needs. I mean, we have been disproportionately impacted by this pandemic because we're more likely to be frontline workers where there is need, and also challenged because of the pandemic in sustaining and keeping our jobs in meaningful ways. And that has ripple effect on families and others. And we want our families to be safe. We have multi-generational, some people live in multi-generational households. It's not just me, it's my parents or grandparents, and that matters. Institutions that have been effective, and not all of them have been, but have really focused on putting the student first. And by that, I'll give you two examples of some of what we've seen. Again, not to negate the challenges, but it's what we do with it that I think defines and refines our commitment to our community. And imagine what would be possible with the kind of investment that our community deserves economically, socially, educationally, right? We work with some institutions that said, you know, we've got to reach out to students and engage them. And I will say, I don't know that I'm just focusing on the positive, but I will say, you know, the structural inequities we've always known existed for our community have become more public than they ever have been. And for institutions to say, we got to put students first. Why? Because we need to keep them enrolled, or we've got to retain them, whatever that is. We had an institution we work with that made 35,000 phone calls in 2 weeks. Every faculty, staff, and administrator picked up the phone and called students to let them know we care, we're available, how can we help? Any institution could do that. I mean, it's a lift, it's a labor of love, but the power that sent to students that they were not just a number and invisible is really important. It made it student-centered. And that institution had flat enrollment through the summer and actually seeing a slight spike in enrollment in the fall. And that's at a time that others are seeing significant decreases. And then others that are working with employers. I know we're going to talk about workforce, but many HSIs we work with really are focused on the service area, the communities they serve and the employers. And creating relationships with employers is important. So we had one institution that reached out to a local employer, a hotel and others, and said, let's train our students who are in hotel management to be frontline, but to be cutting edge in the security, the health needs to address this pandemic, so that they graduate ready to be there working with you immediately, because they know the safety and sanitation of those needs to be effective in hotel management. And that's a direct connection to why many students go to college, is to get that kind of support. But that awareness the institution created of who's my service area, who are my students, and who are the employers where they go in my community, and how do I adjust and adapt, that to me is the difference between an effective and intentional institution and one that is just focused on enrollment and leaving it up to the student to figure it all out on their own.
So the value proposition of this seal of Excelencia is intentionality, and then knowing who you're serving leads us into our next topic, which is about the workforce. And your organization has been doing research on workforce for years now. And I do want to point out to our readers that there's an excellent report that your organization delivered right as the pandemic was starting out, and it's called Tapping Latino Talent, How HSIs Prepare Latino Students for the Workforce, co-authored by Janet Martinez, one of your senior analysts and researchers, and yourself. And this is an important report. This has been years in the making, but it also speaks to this whole intentionality, the knowing, and then the employers coming in and trusting and recognizing that there are institutions out there who are truly serving. I wonder if you could speak to that, please.
Yeah. Well, I guess there's one more word I would connect that to, and that's alignment, right? Intentionality, knowledge, and alignment. Because this piece, stems from work we have been doing for a while. So thank you, Anthony. It's great to know that our work is helpful to others, yourself as a researcher and those in the field. I mean, that's why we try to do it, right? I will tell you, it was a genesis that was a long time in making to culminate this. And if you don't mind, I'll share a little bit of that because I think it's important for the context. We kept hearing from graduate schools and employers that they wanted to diversify. They wanted more Latinos, but we either weren't getting degrees in the areas they needed them in, or they couldn't find us. And back to the idea of no excuses for inaction, like the groundwork database, we're like, well, wait a minute. Maybe it's got something to do with how you're looking to recruit us. So we created a series called Finding Your Workforce, where very simply with data, we took a look at the top 25 institutions graduating Latinos from certificate through PhD. And then we did some specific disciplines as a way of trying to better understand, like STEM and health, areas we knew that either many Latinos were graduating from or that not enough. The reason we did that is because we wanted to make clear at the end of the day, if you're recruiting from the same 15 institutions, the Ivies or the flagships, you're not going to find where Latinos are that are graduating. If you are committed to diversifying your graduate school or others, you need to be paying attention to where we are, not just expecting us to find you. That continued this journey of discussion about your workforce. We did some work with Gallup, where we were able to give institutions the ability to take an alumni survey, and many of these institutions don't have the resources to stay engaged and connect with alumni to see how the alumni rated and valued the contributions of the institution with their workforce experience, and found some really great findings there. And then we decided we needed to go deeper. We needed to understand the institution's commitment and role to align their educational experience and the success of Latino students with the workforce. And so what you see in Tapping Latino Talent is a way of framing, unapologetically with a Latino lens, what institutions are doing and what we need to be thinking about as our workforce continues to evolve, and with a focus on what does this mean for Latino students specifically. And so what you see there, Anthony, is our approach to frame what we think is a necessary conversation about institutional effort. Because we know already students are making an effort, they're enrolling, they're trying to get a quality education. Institutions are doing a lot, but it's not often captured or shared that way. So we had 5 core findings from this, Anthony. We try to put it in buckets, like, from a good policy person, and from there go into detail. We worked with a couple of institutions. We worked with mainly 4-year institutions in this case, but we are working with a lot of community colleges. Felician University, that's in New Jersey, it's a private institution. Florida International University, a very large public institution. The Lehman College in New York, and Texas Women's University, obviously in Texas. So we were looking for geographic diversity. We were looking at size variance. I want to say, what are you doing to connect your students? And of the 5 findings, we found what are promising strategies and approaches is the following. So workforce preparation was not just left to the career services office, like, job offices. And that's really important. That meant faculty have a role, administrators have a role, staff have a role in helping students. And it's not just all left to the career office to help with the resumes and others. And that's important because that's leveraging. A lot of faculty are still connected to the industries, and the ability to connect is really important for students, right? So we can talk more about that if you like. But the other is that experiential learning. We know over 40% of Latinos who go to college are the first in their family to go to college, might not have experience or the professional network. So experiential learning is core to give them access to the kinds of employment opportunities that a degree might yield. It also allows them to get paid while they are in college. And that is a significant issue of affordability. We worked with some institutions that had to fundraise in order to pay students for internships because the employer didn't pay. So imagine students who are investing and trying to advance their education and exposure and having to take an internship as an unpaid effort when we know that the income level of many of our students would tend to be more low income than not. So to see institutions that were that proactive and finding ways while they were still students, as well as connecting them as they graduated, were significant. I think the others are efforts that we saw was that they were really focusing on how to better connect with employers and have them involved in the disciplinary effort. There's a practical fundraising quality here, but also showing value add in your service area, that you're connecting with employers, and that in turn helps students, because then employers are gonna recruit and engage with the campus and invest and help inform curriculum in this very changing workforce environment. So we found efforts like that. And then the need to adjust and adapt to the economy, but also students' needs. So we saw that a lot in healthcare areas and others where institutions were looking to pivot to find ways to meet the economic needs, but also the interests of students, so that students could find employment rather than in esoteric fields where it would be more challenging for them to be able to get employed. And then the last thing I'll say is that, you know, we were getting ready to launch this, as you mentioned, Anthony, just before the pandemic. And we decided to hold the peace for a little bit and reach back out to the institutions just after the pandemic had gotten started. It was about a month or so in, and asked them, you know, we wrote this lovely piece. We tried to codify what it is it's going to take for institutions to tap Latino talent. How does that change given this pandemic? And again, it was still early on, but I will tell you, institutions pivoted immediately, and they did a couple of things. One, they said we have to help students with basic needs. So if they're not eating or they can't find access, then they're not going to stay, and they're not going to be able to be engaged in their educational experience and in experiential learning. So we have to pivot to help there. They also wanted to make sure that they provided, you know, their career services and other support remotely. And that was quite a challenge for many of them, because so much of this is kind of human contact, one-on-one, to be able to figure out how to provide remote support, but ensuring, especially in the economy that also was challenged at the time, to support their students overall. And they decided they needed to do more online networking and reach back out to alumni and help students prepare in a way that many students hadn't been prepared. So those are just some of the things that we saw people do. And we wanted to tell this story, Anthony, because we know people have to be paying attention, policymakers, decision makers, about what's actionable and what are others doing, so that they can see it's possible for them too.
So one of the great stories that stands out in my mind about that was when you interviewed FIU, Florida International University, and he talked about the ways that he was thinking about students' successful connection to workforce, and how he was extending himself and the authority of his office to entice employers to come to campus to make opportunities more convenient for students. And then another was this experience of one of the students who was impacted. And that kind of reveals how all of this work is bearing fruit. So the student, Nicholas, who was a student, a STEM student at FIU, I think he was a bioengineering student,
Right.
was doing this important lab work remotely. And the institution had pivoted to provide him with the materials and then the resources so that he could continue his studies and, by extension, be competitive for the job market. So I think it's a great study, and the stories, those stories in particular, stood out to me.
Stories are powerful, right? And you know, and this again speaks to the resilience of our community and the ability to figure out how to remain with the quality of education we need, but not letting go of the needs of students in the process. And we have lots of those kinds of stories of institutions finding authentic ways, of students who are committing, and never want to forget that it's to support students and to add value to our community that these things are being done. I wish I could say that it was more uniform. I mean, I think we tend to attract institutions that are committed to doing more and are not afraid. I mean, they don't have sacred cows. I think that same president you mentioned from FIU said to us, you know, we don't have, we've been pivoting to adjust and serve our students for a long time. In some ways, as challenging it is, we were made for this pandemic because we don't have any sacred cows. Everything is up for consideration to make sure that our students are served and served well. And whatever we have to do to make that happen, that's what we've been doing even before the pandemic. We're going to continue to do that. And that was powerful to hear an institutional leader own that their responsibility is directly tied to students and their efforts, and that pivoting, just as students and families are doing, requires institutional commitment as well.
Thank you, Deborah. As we think about higher education, the landscape, and the students who are attending, we know that there are students that are in different situations. And I understand that you're doing work on adult learners, and you're also thinking about rural students. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little, please.
Yeah, I will say all of this is tied to our mission of accelerating Latino student success in higher ed. And I think so many conversations, people want that one answer, that one thing. The reality is that we are a young population, but about as many Latino adults have some college, no degree, as have a degree. And we pay attention to the data all the time. We're very data informed. And as people are paying attention to what it takes to serve our communities, we've got to make sure we're paying attention to Latino adult learners as well. And so we partnered with CALE, the Council for Adult and Experiential Learning, because they know adult learners well. We know Latino students well, and we knew we needed to connect the two to better understand what it takes to serve our students well from the strengths and needs they have, not just the crisis and opportunity. And we've looked at prior learning assessment. We are looking at competency-based education with a Latino lens to help inform CALE, but also working with 15 institutions as they look internally. And I will tell you, it is challenging because for many institutions, adult learning experiences are kind of programmatic. They're not core to the institution. And figuring out how to provide the support services, the outreach, the engagement to Latino adults is absolutely key. So Anthony, we are in the middle of our second work there. It is empowering to see institutions that are really working hard to adjust and adapt to serve our adult learners, especially our Latino adult learners, and also becoming aware that it's not just a language issue. That's I teasingly but not say Excelencia's role, is ignorance abatement. And that is true. Ignorance is not knowing. Stupidity you can't do a lot about, but ignorance you can. And to look at Latinos not as a monolith and not just as that 18-year-old, that traditional student, but adult learners, how do we serve them well? I think that can serve other adult learners well. It can also serve other Latino students well. And that to me is that pivot point. We're looking at different elements of this as a way to bring it back for institutional transformation to address the structural inequities so we can serve Latinos and other students better. And that means that we've got to look at workforce, we've got to look at adult learners, we've got to look at these issues in a more robust way and make sure that we don't forget the story of this community while we're trying to address it in bigger scope, because I think increasingly Latinos are bellwethers of what post-traditional students need to take a look at. And that to me is a critical way of thinking about this. It's core to our framework and paradigm and creates opportunities. And I'm sorry, Anthony, you mentioned adult learners and you said one other thing you wanted me to speak to and I forgot what that was.
Rural students.
Oh, yes, gosh, yes. Sorry. Yeah, this goes back to the presumption of monolith and so many Latinos are in rural environments. We know so many of the migrant farm workers and others generations ago have landed in rural spaces and still. And we don't tend to think about that because we think about the urban Latino, which is important as well. So we've been focusing on how to get institutions because, Latino population is growing everywhere. And so in Arkansas, and Tennessee and Kentucky and Appalachia. In fact, in Appalachia, we are the only growth population are Latino. and helping institutions know how to serve us well while serving all their students has been an increased focus for us. We've been doing this work also for about 9 years, looking at rural students and Latino students. And the idea of being a rural serving institution is very aligned with being a Hispanic serving institution. In this particular case, Anthony, we are taking a look in this project that's most recent at Puerto Rico. And outside of San Juan, the rest of the island is pretty rural. I mean, you look at the demographics and others, and we look much more like rural parts of Mississippi and Alabama than we do New York City or Houston and Miami. So, but it's a unique situation to position these institutions and what they're doing and institutional resiliency as trendsetters. And I think that's really another way that we position from an asset-based lens. So you think about the natural disasters, you think about the fiscal constraints, you think about the demography and the leaving the island to the mainland, about the governance challenges that's on the island. I think the institutions who have been resilient despite all of these calamities are really bellwethers of what institutions on the mainland are gonna have to address. Some of them have done a little bit of it, but the confluence of all of those issues, and that, you know, many institutions have closed, but those that have been resilient have done things to contain costs, to show value proposition, have restructured strategies and efforts. And we want to be able to capture, listen, and do research to tell that story, because I believe that institutions already are countering that in the Northeast, but increasingly we're going to see that across the country. And if you can do it with a Latino lens to say, what did it take for the institutions in Puerto Rico to sustain and be resilient in this space? I think that's the way we're going with other institutions where, given this pandemic and even before, we saw demographic declines. We saw the fiscal challenges as states are trying to figure out what their priorities are. So that's another way to bring a Latino lens, but it's about the Latino community, but it's about more than that. It's about higher ed and the need to transform and pay attention and looking at this population as a way to do that. That's what we're trying to do. And looking at rural students, I'll give you one more example, Anthony. I know I'm talking big picture, but because I appreciate when you raise the story of the student. You know, there's University of Puerto Rico is a system, and they have a campus in a small place called Utuado, about 500, less than 1,000 students enrolled, and a town up in the mountains that doesn't have many more than that residents, you know, a couple thousand residents. And the closure of a campus could be the devastation of a small town, because that's also the primary employer if it's the largest business in there, right? That's like a lot of rural places on the mainland. And what does it mean to sustain and to persist? And what are the trade-offs? That has to be part of how we're talking about higher education and what it takes to serve our community well.
Thank you. So Deborah, I have one more question, and then we have a question from the audience. So it seems as though we are on the dawn of a new administration. And so I'm wondering what your hopes are for the Biden-Harris administration in terms of higher education and HSIs.
Good question, Anthony. We haven't had a reauthorization of the Higher Education Act in more than 12 years. 2008 was the last year we reauthorized. It's supposed to be done every 5 years. That's a congressional issue, but I'm hopeful that the administration to come will be able to get more traction on higher education. You know, the First Lady-elect is a community college professor herself. And so there is an awareness and attention, and there was some work that was done during the Obama administration. I think that the Biden-Harris administration to come will continue to build on. As it relates to HSIs, there is much greater awareness and attention to the construct that is HSI. And I believe that there will be attention in the investment being made to these institutions, but also the need to make sure there's more accountability for public investment in those institutions. I think that's what we can expect. I know that it's in the construct of looking at minority serving institutions, a term I'm not a big fan of, because increasingly we're not the minority, we're going to be increasingly the majority, and where HSIs fit compared to our colleagues at historically Black colleges and universities and tribal colleges and universities who were created with mission to serve, unlike HSIs, which are based on enrollment. So I think the opportunity to see when HSIs enroll 2/3 of Latinos in undergraduate, that this is a population of institutions to support and invest in, while raising standards and expectations of what it means to serve. I think we're going to see that in the administration if I was reading tea leaves. And I think there's also a focus on the community and what that means when you look at for-profit institutions and kind of affordability questions that need to happen about access and sustainability.
Thank you. I'm going to take an audience question now. Cristan Corrales says, has Excelencia considered looking at the process and how Latinx students acquire various forms of capital, social, cultural, etc., in higher education, and how universities through an organizational context broker this process for them?
Great question. We've done some of that. Frankly, not enough. We've framed it from a kind of social mobility element, and we rely on a lot of good research, by the way, that's done now by a lot of Latinx scholars to help inform our thinking on this, because unfortunately in public policy, it isn't discussed enough. We've talked about it in context, just I'm trying to answer your question. I know it won't be as full as you would like, but we've looked at how do we get institutions to build on the assets Latinos already bring to higher education, rather than presuming they don't have any, strip them of it and try to build it themselves. So take, for example, the family as a part of a social network to build on, rather than presuming they don't have that knowledge base and include them in that effort. That's part. And then from a workforce perspective, we are looking at what elements of cultural, social, economic, social capital can be leveraged. But we've not done a lot of analysis on the institutional role in that. We see it as a throughput. So I think that there's a lot of good work that can happen there to articulate that and what it means and what the institutional role is in making that happen. We do look at culturally responsive and pedagogy when we work with faculty, but I'll acknowledge I am not a curricular expert. We work with those who are. So we point people in the direction of those who are doing that critical frontline work. So we focus on the policy implications and understanding it.
Thank you, Deborah. It's been a pleasure spending time talking to you today about the good work at Excelencia. I look forward to seeing you the next time that I'm in Washington. I want to let all of our listeners know that this webinar will be posted on our website at CCWT in the next couple of days. And if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to contact me and I'll follow up. Thanks again, Deborah. You have a great day.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you all. Appreciate it.